The letter arrived in Collerston on a Tuesday in late April, folded twice inside a plain envelope with no wax seal. The postmaster read the address, set it in the slot for the Whitmore ranch, and did not say a word to anyone until supper. By supper, his wife knew. By morning, the woman at the dry goods counter knew. By the time the stage from Abilene rolled in 2 days later, a small collection of people had found reasons to be near the platform that they could not entirely explain. She stepped down before the stage had fully stopped. She was carrying a single brown leather bag, worn at the corners, with a brass clasp that had been repaired with a strip of rawhide. She wore a gray traveling dress that had been pressed but showed the wrinkles of 2 days' journey, and a hat with no ornament except a small crease in the brim where she had gripped it against the wind through the open window. She was not young in the way that invites commentary. She was composed in the way that forecloses it. She stood on the platform and looked at the street. Collerston was a town of one main road, an ambition it had not yet earned. There was a general store with a porch that leaned slightly east, a livery, a barber shop with a striped post faded by 2 summers of hard sun, a church at the far end whose bell had been cracked since 1871 and rang a half-tone flat at every service. She looked at all of it without expression. In her bag was a letter, not the one that had traveled to Abilene to find her, but her reply. She had kept the reply by accident, meaning to post it, and then finding herself already on the stage before she remembered. The letter said 3 sentences. It said she could cook and mend and manage a house. It said she understood the arrangement. It said she would come. She had written nothing about the parcel of land she had seen, described in the original notice, which had been posted through a correspondence agency out of Kansas City, which had used the phrase, good producing acreage, in a way that she suspected was not quite accurate. She had grown up on her uncle's farm in eastern Missouri. She knew what good producing meant, and she knew what it did not mean. And she had read the phrase twice and made a private decision. The man who had written the original notice was not on the platform. She waited 4 minutes. She counted them by the movement of the shadows across the livery door. Then she picked up her bag. The postmaster's wife was standing near the general store, not quite watching. She crossed the street toward her and asked where she might find the road that ran north toward the Whitmore property. The woman told her. She thanked her and started walking. The road ran north out of town between 2 lines of cottonwood that had not yet leafed out, their branches pale and thin against a sky the color of old linen. The ground was dry, not the dry of a season's drought, but the dry of a land that had forgotten what wet felt like, the kind of dry that had worked itself into the soil, so long it had become the soil's nature. She walked with her bag in her right hand and shifted it to her left after the first quarter-mile, and then shifted it back. The road was not long. She could see the property before she reached it. There was a house, that was not nothing. 2 stories, which was more than she had expected, though the second story had a window with no glass in it and something dark around the frame that might have been rot or might have been old smoke. A barn that was standing but not plumb, leaning east the way things lean when the west wind has had years to work on them. A fence line that ran along the north side of the property and then stopped, as if whoever had built it had run out of either material or intention and had not gone back to resolve the question. She stood at the edge of the property for a moment. The land itself was the thing. She had known from the phrase in the notice, but seeing it was different from knowing it. The fields to the east and west of the house had been broken at some point. She could see the old furrow lines still faintly ridged, but nothing had grown there in at least 2 seasons, maybe 3. The soil at the surface had crusted over. There was a quality to that crust she recognized. Her uncle had called it dead skin. The earth underneath was not necessarily gone, but whatever had been attempted here had been abandoned, and the land had pulled its resources inward the way a person pulls inward after enough. Disappointment. She picked up her bag and walked toward the house. The front step was loose. She felt it move under her foot and stepped to the side of it and knocked on the door. No one answered. She tried the latch. It opened. Inside was dim and smelled of dust and something underneath the dust. Grease, maybe, or old wool. A table. Two chairs, one of them pulled back at an angle as if someone had stood up from it recently and not pushed it in. A stove that had cold ash in it. A window over the table that faced west, and through it she could see the flat line of the property running out toward the horizon, the soil pale and bare and still. She set her bag down on the table. She stood there a moment, looking through that window. Then she went to the stove and opened it and looked at what she had to work with. The ash was cold through and through. Not the cold of a fire banked overnight, the cold of something that had not been lit in days, maybe longer. There was a small stack of wood beside the stove, 4 pieces, bark still on them. A tin box on the shelf above held matches, and a stub of tallow candle and nothing else. She built the fire small and careful, the way you build one when you are not sure yet what the chimney does. It drew well. She watched the smoke go up and was satisfied. The kitchen had a pantry off the back wall. Inside she found a sack of cornmeal half full, salt in a crock, dried beans in a jar with no lid, a twist of something that had been jerky once and was now leather, a tin of lard gone slightly off but usable. She stood in the doorway of that pantry for a moment and made an accounting, not a judgment, an accounting. She went back outside. The well was around the east side of the house, which she had not yet walked. She found it and lowered the bucket and listened. The water was there. The rope went down farther than she expected before the sound changed, but it came up clean and cold. She drank from her cupped hand and looked at the sky. Afternoon. Still several hours of light. She carried 2 full buckets back to the house and set one beside the stove and took the other out past the fence line into the field. The soil at the edge was better than the center. Not much, but she could feel it. A slight give underfoot, a different color at the surface, less pale. Someone had tried to plow in the last few years. She could see the old furrow lines if the light caught them right, shallow and now nearly filled in by wind. But the structure was there underneath. She crouched and pressed her palm flat against the ground. Dry, but not dead. Not all the way. She carried water to 3 different spots along the east edge. Not enough to do anything useful. She knew that. But she pressed her hand into the soil after each and waited to feel what it did with the moisture. At 2 of the spots, nothing. At the third, the soil darkened and held it, pulled it in rather than letting it pool on the surface. She marked the place in her mind. A fence post 3 posts from the corner, the one with the wire twisted higher than the others. She went back inside and started the beans. She had the cornmeal going when she heard the horse. She did not go to the window. She heard the animal slow, heard the leather sounds of dismounting, heard a pause that lasted longer than necessary, and then the loose step on the porch moved under someone's weight. She heard him stop in the doorway before she heard him speak. "Fence line on the east side," he said. "One of the posts is leaning." She did not turn from the stove. I saw it. A pause. The kind that meant he was deciding whether that answer was a problem or not. She let him decide. "I'll reset it after supper." "All right," she said. She heard him pull out the chair at the near end of the table, not the head the side, and sit. Not to eat, just to sit. She registered that without comment, the way you register the temperature of a room when you walk into it. She set the beans down first and then the cornbread, and she brought 2 plates and set one in front of him without ceremony. He looked at the food and nodded her, which suited her fine. She sat and they ate. Outside, the wind had come up from the southwest, the way it did every evening, not hard enough to matter, just steady. It found the gap at the base of the window frame and made a low, persistent sound against the wood. "How much of the east field has you tried?" she asked. He looked up. "Tried for what?" "Water, retention. How deep does it go before the soil changes?" He considered that. Not the way a man considers a challenge, but the way a man considers something he has thought about for a long time, without getting anywhere with it. About 16 inches, he said. Maybe 18 on the low end. Below that, it's caliche. Solid. She nodded. There's a spot along the east edge that pulls water down, naturally. He looked at her steadily. Where? Third post from the corner. The one where the wires twisted. He was quiet for a moment. That's always been wetter there after rain. I know, she said, though she hadn't known until today. But the soil had told her the same thing the light had told her about the old furrows, that this land had not always been this dry, and that it remembered something different. He ate without speaking for a time. The well's pulling sediment, he said finally. Started 2 weeks ago. I've been watching it. She had noticed the color of the water this morning. She had not mentioned it. That's why you wanted someone who could carry, she said. It was not a question, and he did not treat it like one. He set his fork down and looked at his plate. That's part of it. She did not ask what the rest of it was. She got up and brought the coffee pot from the back of the stove and poured for both of them and set the pot on the trivet and sat back down. Outside, the wind moved. The gap in the window frame went on with its low sound. He picked up his cup and she picked up hers and they sat with the food, between them and the evening, pressing in from every side. The sediment had started as a bruise in the water, a faint reddening, almost beautiful in certain light, the kind a person could convince themselves was a trick of the bucket. She had not convinced herself. She'd held the second pail up that morning and watched the color settle toward the bottom and understood it for what it was. After supper, she carried the dishes to the basin without being asked. He moved past her to bank the stove, and she noticed how he did it. Methodically, without waste, the same way he'd moved the wood that first afternoon. He had a rhythm to his evenings already formed, and she was fitting herself into the spaces around it, not because he required it, but because it was the sensible thing. She set the dishes to dry and went to the door and looked out. The sky held color still, a thin band of amber at the horizon where the sun had been. The yard was still. The windmill was still. The air smelled like dust and something else she couldn't name, something older than dust, like the ground itself had exhaled. She heard him behind her. He didn't come to the door. She heard the scrape of the chair, the soft sound of him sitting back down at the table. She stayed where she was a moment longer, then stepped out onto the porch. The floorboard shifted under her left foot. She felt it, a softness in the grain, a give that wasn't right. She stood there with her weight on it, testing it carefully, and it flexed again beneath her heel. She looked down. The board was warped, split faintly along one edge where weather had gotten in. Anyone could feel it. She wondered how long he'd been stepping over it or around it, the way a person does when something is familiar enough to become invisible. She went back inside. He was at the table with the lamp drawn close, looking at something she couldn't see. When she came in, he glanced up. The third board on the porch, she said. He was quiet a moment. I know. It'll go through before winter. I know, he said again, and there was nothing defensive in it. Just the plain acknowledgement of a man with a long list and not enough hours. She did not say anything more about it. She took the towel from the basin rack and hung it straight and went to the lamp on the shelf near the window and trimmed the wick down until it barely held its thread of light. I'll need to look at the well in the morning, she said. He looked up from the table. You don't need to do that. I know what sediment means, she said. And you've got 12 acres of ground here that's done this before. I want to see where the water used to go. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might refuse. Then he said, all right. That was all. She set the lamp low and went to her room. Morning came gray and still, the kind of still that happens before a real wind decides what it wants to do. She was up before the light was full. She dressed, took her boots from beside the door, and laced them at the table without lighting a lamp. By the time she stepped outside, the sky was the color of ash, and the grass along the fence line held the last of the night's cold in its blades. He was already at the well. He had the bucket drawn up and was looking down into the shaft with the rope looped once around his wrist, which she recognized as a habit. The hand held busy so the face can stay neutral. She came and stood beside him and looked down, too. The smell came up first. Not rot, but something earthen and close. The smell of still water under pressure it couldn't find its way out of. "How long has it been low?" she asked. "Since June." She straightened and walked the perimeter of the well housing, looking at the ground. The soil near the north face was a different color. Not wet, but darker, compacted differently. She crouched down and pressed 2 fingers into it, came up with a pinch and felt it between her fingers until it broke apart. "It's not dry," she said. "It's blocked." He came around to where she was crouching. She pointed to where the darker soil ran in a shallow line northeast toward the fence. He looked at it for a moment. "Clay pan," he said. "Old creek bed, maybe. Or something sheeted over when this land was broken." She stood. "Either way, the water's sitting somewhere it can't get to you. It's not gone." He looked out over the field northeast of the well. It was flat, unremarkable, grown over with the same dry grass as the rest. But she'd seen a field like this before. The summer she was 13, her father had walked her across 40 acres of land that looked dead and told her to find the water. She hadn't known how to look then. She did now. "The ground dips," she said. "There." She nodded toward a long, shallow depression, maybe 60 yards out, hard to see unless the light was low. "That's where it wants to go. You'd need to break the pan and give it a channel. But the water's there. It's been there." He stood looking at where she'd pointed. She picked up the bucket he'd left on the rim and set it inside the housing, out of the wind. "How do you know this?" he said. Not quite a question. "My father had land like this," she said. "He lost it." She left that sentence where it was and walked back toward the house. He followed her inside at a distance. She didn't look back to see if he would. She set the kettle on and stood at the window while it heated, watching the field northeast of the well. From this angle, the depression was invisible, but she knew it was there. The land didn't lie about itself, not to anyone who'd learned to watch it lose. She heard him come through the door, heard him stop. He sat down at the table without being asked. That was new. He'd been careful about the kitchen since she arrived, pausing at the threshold, taking up as little room as possible, as if he understood it had become hers in some way and was uncertain what that cost him. Now he just sat, the way a man sits when he's stopped rehearsing. She poured 2 cups and set one in front of him. He looked at it. Then he looked at her when she sat across from him, and she let him look. "Your father," he said, "when he lost it, drought took the crops 2 years running. Bank took the land the third. Where was this?" "Kansas, 12 miles outside Abilene." He turned the cup in his hands. The coffee was still too hot to drink, but she didn't tell him that. "How old were you?" he said. 15 when we left. 13 when he started walking me across it, showing me things." She paused. He knew before the bank did. He just didn't want to know that he knew. The kettle clicked against the stovetop. She got up and moved it off the heat, and when she sat back down, he was still looking at his hands. "I've been thinking the same way," he said. She didn't respond. "Not about the bank." He set the cup down, "About knowing something and not wanting to know you know it." She waited. He didn't finish the thought. Maybe he didn't mean to get that close to it. He picked up his cup and drank, and she let the silence stay. Outside, the wind moved across the dry grass. Through the window, she could see the cottonwood at the corner of the fence line bending and releasing, the way things do when they've learned to give instead of resist. She thought about her father walking her across that land, the way he'd pointed to a low spot behind the barn and said, "That's where the water used to run." Past tense already, the loss already completed in the way he said it. She had not let herself think about him in some time. It surprised her, the sharpness of it. She looked at the man across from her, his jaw, the way his hands were still on the table now, not turning the cup. "We'd need a spade," she said, "and a second pair of hands for a day." "I can get both," he said. They started the following morning. He came before the light was fully up, a spade over one shoulder and a second one resting against the fence post like he'd set it there the night before and gone home to sleep. She was already outside. She had walked the low ground behind the barn in the last hour of dark, feeling for the places where the soil changed under her boots. The softer patches, the slight give that meant something had moved through here once, water or memory of water. She showed him where she wanted to start. He didn't ask how she knew. He set the blade and pushed down with his boot and turned the first scoop without ceremony. They worked without much talk. The ground was hard at the surface, a crust of dry seasons laid over dry seasons, but underneath it changed, darker, heavier. She felt it before he said anything. The way the soil came up different on the third and fourth turn of the spade, a faint smell like something that had been waiting. Here, she said. He stopped, looked down at what the blade had turned up. They kept going. By mid-morning, they had opened a channel 3 feet deep and 6 feet long, and the color of the earth at the bottom had gone nearly black. She knelt and pressed 2 fingers into it and held them up. Damp, not wet, but not the bone-dry powder of the rest of the yard either. She didn't say anything. She stood and looked down the line of what they'd opened, and then out toward the pasture where the ground sloped away from. The barn in a long, slow grade she hadn't been able to see from the house, only from here, only from this angle. The slope runs that direction, she said. He looked. I see it. If there's water moving, it's moving that way. We'd need to redirect it. Build up the west side of the channel. Let gravity do the rest. He was quiet for a moment. He turned and looked at the house, then back at the pasture, then down into the channel. That's not a morning's work, he said. No, she said. It's not. He picked up his spade and planted it at the next point and drove it down. She watched him work for a moment. The line of his shoulders, the economy of the motion, nothing wasted in it, just the same steady force applied again and again. She thought of a word her father had used for land that hadn't been read right. Abandoned, he'd called it, though what he meant was that no one had listened to it long enough to understand what it needed. She picked up her spade. The sun was over the roof of the barn now, full and hot, and the wind had gone still the way it sometimes does in the middle of a working day, as if the world were simply watching to see what would happen next. They worked through the heat of mid-morning without speaking. She had learned by then that silence between them was not absence. It was a kind of shared attention, the way two people can read the same page without pointing at the words. He moved along the channel and she moved with him, a few feet behind, watching how the tool met the earth, adjusting her own angle to match the resistance. The ground was harder than it looked. It gave at the surface and then pushed back, packed dense by years of no movement. She worked the spade in short strokes and felt the ache climb from her wrists to her shoulders. She did not stop. By the time the sun had passed its highest point, they had cleared perhaps 30 feet of the channel's west wall. It was not much. She stood back and looked at it. The raw new face of the earth, darker than the surface, faintly damp in the way that told her they were reading it correctly. He crouched down and put his hand against the exposed wall and held it there. Feel that, he said, without looking up. She crouched beside him and pressed her palm flat against the earth. It was cool, not just shaded, genuinely cool, the way ground gets when water is close beneath it. How deep do you think? She said. Not deep enough yet, but it's there. He stood and wiped his hand on his thigh and looked down the length of what they'd done. She could see him calculating something, not in the way of a man uncertain, but in the way of a man deciding how much of a thing he is willing to say out loud. We'll need to build up the opposite bank, he said. Create a berm to hold the redirect. Otherwise, when the rains come, it'll just spread back out the way it was. When do you think the rains will come? He looked at the sky. It had gone from white to a deeper blue as the afternoon moved in, the kind of color that meant the season was thinking about turning. Few weeks, he said, maybe less. She looked at the 30 feet of cleared wall, and then at the 150 still ahead of them. She looked at the house, and the kitchen garden she'd started against the south wall, and the pasture beyond that, and somewhere past the pasture, the line where his land ended and someone else's began. She thought of the word abandoned. Again, her father had meant it as a failure of listening. She understood something now that she hadn't when she was young, that the listening was not the hard part. The hard part was deciding you had the right to act on what you heard. She picked up her spade, so did he. They worked until the light went flat. The cleared channel stretched another 40 feet by the time she straightened and pressed her hand against the small of her back. He was still moving, not quickly but without pause, the way a man works when he has stopped thinking about the work and is simply doing it. She watched him for a moment, the way his shoulders set when the spade hit a root, the way he didn't curse, just repositioned and tried again. She went to fill the water jug. When she came back, he was crouching at the edge of the channel, studying something she couldn't see from where she stood. She handed him the jug without speaking. He drank, handed it back, and pointed to where a section of the old bank had slumped inward. "That'll need reinforcing before we redirect," he said. "If we push water through before that's solid, we lose everything we've cut." She crouched beside him. The slumped earth was dark and soft, almost the color of the earth she'd turned in the kitchen garden. She pressed 2 fingers into it, and they sank to the second knuckle without resistance. "How do we make it solid?" "Pack it with rock first, then sod. Let it sit a few days before we run water up against it." She looked at the slumped section. 8 feet, maybe 10. She looked at the surrounding ground, which was not short on rock. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow." They walked back to the house in the last of the light. She noticed he had started walking slightly closer to her than he had in the first weeks. Not close enough to be remarkable, just close enough that when the ground was uneven, she felt the shift of air beside her before she felt the ground change underfoot. She didn't think he knew he was doing it. She made supper. He washed at the pump in the yard. When he came in, his hair was damp, and he smelled like cold water and cut earth, and she thought, briefly, practically, that this was what the land smelled like when it was about to be useful. They ate without much talking. That had been true for several weeks now, and it had shifted from something she was managing to something she simply inhabited. The quiet was different from the quiet of the early days. It had texture to it. After supper, he spread the rough map on the table again and made 2 new marks in pencil, the slumped section, and a note about the berm position. She stood beside him and looked at it. The map was becoming complicated in the way that living things become complicated, each decision opening into the next. The candle on the table was nearly down to its last inch. Neither of them moved to replace it. The candle went out on its own, not dramatically. It simply reached the end of what it had and went dark, and for a moment neither of them moved. The room had the particular quality of darkness that comes just after a light source fails, not total black, but the memory of light still present on the eye, fading. He got up and found the tin box on the shelf by feel. She heard the scratch of a match. A new candle took. He set it in the holder and sat back down. The map was still between them. She looked at the 2 new marks he'd made. The pencil lines were careful. He drew the way he worked, without wasted motion, each mark meaning exactly one thing. She touched the edge of the paper. Not the marks themselves, just the margin. "If the berm holds through a hard rain," she said, "the east plot could take seed in April." He looked at where she was pointing. "Might be March if it's a mild winter." It was October. 5 months was not very long. She had been here 5 months already and could not entirely account for where they had gone, only that they had gone. Into the ground, into the rows, into evenings like this one, with a map between them and a candle that had burned itself out. He folded the map along its original creases and set it to one side. She gathered the dishes. He didn't offer to help, which she had stopped expecting. But when she turned from the basin, He had put the candle back on the sill and was sitting at the table with his hands flat on the wood, not doing anything in particular. Just present, the way a house is present, not asking anything, simply there. She dried her hands. Outside the wind had come up, not hard but consistent, the kind that moved through grass in long, slow sweeps and made the cottonwood at the property line toss its upper branches. She could hear it through the window glass. "The berm on the north side," she said. "It's lower than the south. I know. It'll need another foot before the ground freezes." "I know," he said again, and his voice had nothing in it but acknowledgement. He had already thought about it. He was always already thinking about it. The land, the work, what needed doing next. She had come to recognize this quality in him not as distance but as a kind of faithfulness, that he gave his attention fully, and that he had given it to this place, and that she had, without choosing a single moment to do so, become part of what he attended to. The wind moved through the cottonwood again. She sat back down at the table, not because there was more to discuss, just because the chair was there, and he was there, and the candle was burning, and the night was long. The ground froze 3 weeks later. She was up before him as she had been since August, and she stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched the first real frost take the fields. It settled evenly, the way snow settles but thinner, a white that was almost not white, more like the land had gone quiet overnight and the quiet had a color. The grass stood stiff. The berm on the north side held. He had put in the extra foot. She had not watched him do it. She had come out one afternoon to find it done. The earth packed and shaped, the line of it clean against the sky. He had not mentioned it. She had not mentioned it. But she had stood there for a long moment with her hand on the gate-post, looking at the work before she went back inside. That was how things had passed between them all autumn. Work done and noticed, noticed and not remarked upon. The remarking was somewhere underneath, accumulating the way snow accumulates, not in any single flake, but in the weight of it by morning. She poured a second cup and set it on the counter beside the first. He came down the stairs without hurry, pulled on his coat, saw the cup, picked it up. They stood at the window together and watched the frost hold the field. "It'll thaw by noon," he said. "Probably. Ground's ready, though." She nodded. She could see it herself. The soil had taken what the summer had given, the water, the roots, the patient reworking of what had been cracked and spent, and it had changed, not dramatic, just different than it had been, darker, capable of more. He set his cup down and went out to the barn. She watched him cross the yard, his breath visible in the cold air, his stride unhurried. He stopped at the gate and looked at the north berm the way she had looked at it in October. Just stood there for a moment, then went through. She turned from the window. On the table was the seed catalog she had sent for in September. She had dog-eared a dozen pages. He had left it once on the counter closer to his chair than it had been before, and she understood that he had looked through it, though he had said nothing. Two of her dog-eared pages had small pencil marks beside them. She had not made those marks. She opened to the first of them now. A late-season root variety, something that could go deep in alkaline soil and hold. Outside, she could hear him moving in the barn, the low sound of the latch, the animals settling. She smoothed the catalog page flat with the palm of her hand and read. The frost was still on the fields, and the morning was just beginning.